Can you define equity in 10 minutes? My name is Latish Reed, and let's talk about equity. Last week, I introduced a mini series about equity, something that we could talk about in the midst of this pandemic. Disclaimer: the things that I discuss in these videos are not germane to one particular district, school, or an individual person. These are broad concepts. So before I get started, I want to give a shout out to all the super teachers out there who are making it happen for kids in spite of the shutdown. Okay, now what is equity? Well, right now, in some places, in some cases, it is a buzzword. However, there are many equity directors, equity chiefs, equity positions, departments being created. But the challenge is people don't always know exactly what it means to have a person that is facilitating equity within their space. Dr. Dakota Irby and Dr. Terrence Green, both researchers, are planning to do a study to really take a look at what some of the equity positions are and what exactly they're responsible for in a district. So stay tuned. Last week, I introduced you to the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction model to inform culturally responsive practices, where equity is at the center. Typically, people want to begin at the end. They just want to know, what do I need to do? What are the skills? What are the practices? When in all actuality, we really need to begin with becoming more self-aware. And becoming more self-aware means that we need to understand the definition of equity. So let's take a look at some simple definitions. Remember, I only have 10 minutes, so it's not so deep and wonderful. The first thing that we need to do is understand that there is a difference between equality and equity. And if we had our students trying to figure out what something was, first thing we probably would do is send them to the dictionary. And so I have two definitions here. The first is from Merriam-Webster, meaning the state of being equal, and the other, which goes a little deeper from the Cambridge Dictionary, says that it's the right of different groups of people to have a similar social position and receive the same treatment. So there are some examples there for you to see. Equity, on the other hand, is just a little bit more difficult to understand, but it basically means that you need to provide more support and resources to those who need more based on past inequalities. What I would encourage you to do, if you're doing this on a district level, if you are doing this on a school level, to have a smaller group of people really look at a number of other definitions that districts have already put together. My work was really heavily based on the definition of the Washington State Board of Education equity lens. Now, you may already be familiar with this next picture. It's pretty widespread, but it gives us a basic visual of what equity is in comparison to equality. On the left-hand side, you will see the definition of equality. Each person has the same resource to see over the fence. Whereas on the right-hand side, the person that is very tall and does not receive the box. Whereas the person on the far right needs to have additional support to be able to see over the fence. During the civil rights era, there was a big focus on equality, meaning people who were marginalized were really seeking the same resources, supports that others were receiving. Even though things remain unequal today, we typically are focusing a little bit more on equity because of the past inequalities that have persisted. With that said, we need to consider, what is it that marginalized groups need in order to have the same access. Practical example. I am the eldest of 4 daughters. As you can see, my picture is the biggest. But There are some clear examples of equality and equity within raising children. From an equality standpoint, parents are required to provide food, clothing, shelter, and some structure as they raise their children. But from an equity standpoint, we have to make sure that children have what they need. For example, I'm 9 years older than my youngest sister. And of course, in terms of food, I was eating more than my fair share of solid food, whereas as a newborn, she had to have only milk. Then on the other hand, you had Brandy, who absolutely hated milk. No milk, no ice cream, no cheese. So then my parents had to figure out a different source of calcium to make sure that she had what she needed. At the end of the day, you can see that there are spaces for equality, but there's also a need for equity. At this point, let's take a look at some examples of equality and equity within the educational space. One example of equality in education would be standardized testing. On the other hand, providing options for students to demonstrate their knowledge would be an equitable response. Parent-teacher conferences are usually an equal opportunity for parents to meet with teachers. A lot of times these offerings do not meet the parents' needs, and so offering different formats and times would be an equitable way to address parent interaction. Schools provide food service for all students. However, sometimes the offerings do not always account for religious, dietary, health, and lifestyle preferences. All students have access to grade level curriculum. An equitable response to instruction is to make sure that lessons are differentiated and they're culturally responsive to make sure the needs of all students are met. Now that we understand the differences between equality and equity and their importance, let's take a look at what is at the core of equity work. At the end of the day, we would like to make sure that everyone has the same liberties. Remember, liberty and justice for all. However, we know that the realities are clear, and unfortunately, inequalities and inequities are prevalent, persistent, and problematic. How about that alliteration? Professor George Theo Harris of Syracuse University defines social justice leadership or equitable leadership to mean that we make issues of race, class, gender, disability, sexual orientation, and other historically and currently marginalizing conditions in the U.S. central to the advocacy, leadership practices, and vision. This definition centers on addressing and eliminating marginalization in schools. That's what equity work should be about. Whew, can't believe I did it. Defined equity under 10 minutes. Please comment on this video, like this video, and share this video. If you're interested in having conversations about equity beyond the pandemic crisis, please contact me at latishreed1@gmail.com. Look out for my next video. Thank you for joining me.